Good morning, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome back to the Enterprise AI Show. I'm your host, Brian Gracely, coming to you from Raleigh, North Carolina, home of the Stanley Cup champion Carolina Hurricanes. Good to finally get that out there. It's been fun watching that. For those of you that aren't hockey fans, sorry, but when your local team wins the World Championship, it's a lot of fun. We had the big celebration, the big parade yesterday, and it's been a party around Raleigh for the last week or so. So good times. Also today, Happy Father's Day to all the fathers out there, to all the, to my dad, to Aaron's father, to, everybody who, gets a chance to talk to dad. Give him a call today. Let him know what he's meant to your life. Hopefully he's still around for you. And, but also thank you for all those that are around us that help us dads, do the things that we do and, try and provide for families and others like that. So today I want to dive a little bit into the Father's Day theme, not to get too wrapped up in it, but I got to thinking about if I was trying to explain to my dad kind of some of the insanity of the market that is kind of the uncertainty, the insanity, some of the craziness that's going on with the AI market right now, and I was explaining it to him, say like in the 1970s or the 1980s, before technology had become sort of the center of everything we do. I got to thinking about kind of the things that he would always tell me, just in terms of just how to prepare yourself, how to deal with uncertainty, how to evaluate a situation and determine what role you should play in it, where you could be successful, things that you should avoid. And so I thought what I'd do is I would take some of the situations that we have going on with AI right now, again, some of the uncertainty that's happening, some of the just pace of change that's happening, and apply some dad reasoning to it, which I try and do. I think about it myself as a father, as I'm thinking about my kids. How do we prepare them for a world in which maybe AI is heavily involved, maybe it's not heavily involved. I'll dive into a little bit of that. We're going to get to all that right after the break. Today's show is sponsored by ShareGate. You're out of time. Copilot needs to be deployed ASAP, but your tenant really isn't ready for it. Years of data, permissions, and users lurk in its shadows, ready to be exposed by AI. ShareGate Protect sees it all, so you can find the exposure risks, fix them fast, and deploy AI with confidence. Microsoft 365 Governance, they've got this. Learn more at sharegate.com/protect. Today's show is sponsored by Nasuni. There's a growing gap in AI right now between what's possible in theory and what successfully works at scale inside an enterprise. The difference comes down to unstructured file data. Many AI initiatives struggle because the file data they depend on is scattered, unstructured, and disconnected from where and how work actually happens. Nasuni changes that. It brings your unstructured file data into a single, secure foundation so AI, both generative and agentic, can access it with the context, governance, and performance it needs in production. Bring AI to where your unstructured data lives. See what it takes to activate your data for AI and request a demo at nasuni.com/AI. This episode is brought to you by Outshift, Cisco's incubation engine. AI agents today operate in silos, limiting their potential. Scaling up models isn't enough. We need to scale out. Like humans did 70,000 years ago, agents must share knowledge, goals, and innovation to evolve. Outshift by Cisco is building the Internet of Cognition, transforming isolated AI systems into orchestrated superintelligence. This open infrastructure enables agents and humans to share intent, context, and reasoning. The cognition evolution for agents is here. Learn more at outshift.com. That's outshift.com. And we're back. And as I mentioned, today, at least here in the United States, I don't remember if it is around the world. I should probably look that stuff up. But today's Father's Day, so happy Father's Day to all the fathers out there, and sons and daughters of fathers, and things along those things. But I was thinking about it, and as many of you know, if you work in tech, you're probably getting questions from friends, family, from colleagues, from people that if you tell them that you work on anything having to do with the newest technology, whether it's AI or something else, there's always questions about it. Hey, how does it work? Do I need to learn about that? Does that apply to me? It does seem to be that with AI, because it has such a personal impact on people, right? So many people have actually touched the technology as opposed to, small number of people that have touched service mesh, or small number of people that write Java code, or, have had to worry about scaling out AWS instances or something like that. But if you talk about AI, now, not only have most people played around with it in one way, shape, or form, whether they are talking about, hey, I used ChatGPT to help diagnose that weird mole that was on my arm, or, they said, hey, I used this thing and it said it had AI built in and it kind of did something, whether they liked it or not. So everybody has some sort of experience of it. And then obviously we're seeing a lot of things in the news on a daily basis, whether it is AI impacting the financial markets, whether it's AI impacting jobs, whether it's AI impacting, some sort of, video that, your grandmother or somebody might have sent you and you have to send it back to them and go, oh, no, grandma, that, I know that's really weird and crazy, but that's AI. So it has has a personal impact on a lot of people. And so I was thinking about Father's Day, you sort of, whenever there's holidays or days, kind of important days, you tend to think back and go, okay, let's put some things in perspective. And, I think about my dad. My dad has been, kind of loosely involved with technology. He was an accountant, but he worked for a company that ultimately, one of the companies he worked for made mainframe computers, not IBM, but a different company. He was somebody who, went out and purchased a personal computer early in the cycle. We had an Apple computer back in the late 70s or early 80s. I'd have to look at the exact date. But if, he was very interested in like how we could use this technology, to improve what he did, right? He was an accountant, and, he was learning about spreadsheets and all those sorts of things. And so, he's somebody who has tried to keep up with it. Obviously, I've been involved with it for a long time. He asked questions about it. But, a lot of times we would talk about things, and we would talk about, hey, the stock market is way up for some company. And, him, being in the financial world would always sort of be like, okay, let's get back to like, why is it what it is, right? So he was always trying to understand kind of the fundamentals of things. He didn't necessarily always understand all the technology, but always wanted to understand the fundamentals of things. Because, as a dad or as a father, as you're talking to your kids, you're trying to give them some sort of guidance. And in some cases, you've got lots of experience. Unfortunately, you've got scars and scabs and history in some domain in which you can help your kids out, and you can either, help them be better at that, or help them avoid some sort of mistake, or help them, do something better than you did because you now have some experience that you can pass along. And so, he oftentimes would, as I was doing different things in my career, or, whether it was taking a new job, or, like how much I was traveling or whatever it was, he always would sort of come back to being like, okay, let's look at, kind of what's really going to help me understand this sort of stuff. And so, I made a list of sort of sayings that he was always, kind of sayings and concepts that he was always trying to put in my head, to try and rationalize what was going on. Because again, we see this a lot with technology. Technology tends to repeat things, whether or not it's, people tend to think, oh, that's brand new. It's totally different. But in a lot of cases, if you've got some historical context, or if you are following certain kind of fundamental types of things, you can look at situations, especially when situations feel overwhelming, feel confusing, feel chaotic, and you can start to sort of apply some things to that. And again, I think about this from a dad's perspective, like how would I give some guidance to stuff? Because I know one of the questions that I get all the time from people is, okay, so you work on something that has to do with AI, and people kind of go, hey, I've used it a little bit, and it's interesting. Maybe it does some interesting stuff. Or people say, it's not for me. Won't apply to my job. But oftentimes, anybody you talk to who's a parent is always thinking about, well, how does this relate to my kids? Right? Like my kids are going to be in this marketplace of jobs, whatever those jobs might be, for the next 20, 30, 40 years, depending on how old your kids might be, or maybe they're older than that, 50 years, if your kids are, single digits or in their teens or something like that. And those are the things that, you start having you start having conversations about, like, I don't totally know what the answer is, or, it's really hard to predict what the next 5 years will look like, let alone the next 20 years. And you sort of put things like the internet in context, or mobile phones, or, now we have cars that drive themselves. All that kind of stuff is hard to put in big context of stuff. And so, when I think about those things that my dad used to try and tell me, and I try and pass along to my kids, they are much more fundamental, right? And so I've made a list. I think I got 7 or 8, 9, 10 things here, 7 or 8 things that I think are sort of good to come back to, especially when markets feel kind of crazy, right? And the first one that he used to say a lot, and it was sort of in the context of work, but it was also in the context of, I had a summer job. I was a golf caddy. And he said, a lot of times you're going to go into situations in which you don't totally know what's going on. You may feel like you don't totally belong. Maybe it's a situation in which, it's people that are, executives that are up, at a higher level than you are. Maybe it's you walk into a room and you feel like, okay, I'm not the smartest person in this room, or I'm not the most wealthy person in this room, or I'm not the most experienced person in this room. And his thing, he always used to have this saying. He'd say, show up, keep up, and shut up. And what that ultimately meant was, it wasn't meant to be derogatory. It was, make sure you're always showing up on time, right? Being there, actually showing up, being there a little bit early is something that, surprisingly seems very simple, but not a lot of people do. Keep up, meaning, pay attention to what's going on, right? You're not always going to know what's going on, but do your best to keep up with what's going on. And that could be reading what's going on. That could be just paying attention to the conversations that are happening. Don't get yourself in a situation in which you're kind of blindsided by things. And again, you're not going to know everything, but try and keep up with kind of what the gist of the conversation is, what the general information that's needed to be in that room. And his third thing was, if you don't know what you're talking about, if you don't know the right thing to say, if you don't know, what the norms of the room are, whatever, he said, sometimes you just got to shut up. Sometimes you just got to listen. You just got to kind of take it all in. Don't try and force something that you don't really understand. And I think to a certain extent with AI, there's a lot of people that might be worried about it. And, if you think about it in the context of your job, you got to keep going to work. You got to keep showing up. You got to keep, doing what you need to do on a regular basis. And that repetitiveness, that sort of, just drumbeat that you're dealing with, you got to kind of deal with that. The second thing he would always say is, try and make yourself invaluable, right? Like try and figure out a way that what you do is not only very valuable to the people that you're around or the company that you're with, but try and make yourself invaluable. And that doesn't mean hoarding information. That doesn't mean, kind of gatekeeping stuff. It means, make it so that not only are you very good at least one thing at what you do, but also let the people around you know that you're good at that, right? Like you don't have to go about bragging about it, but make sure that they're aware that like, hey, when these things happen, this is the person you go to, right? So sort of make yourself invaluable. And I know AI is trying to, democratize a lot of skills. And obviously you hear these crazy topics of like AI is going to be able to do all these different jobs. But make sure for the job that you're with, the people that you're with, the skills that you have, that you make yourself as invaluable as possible, right? And not just knowing that you're good at what you're doing, but make it outward that you're good at what you're doing, right? Third thing he would talk about all the time, a lot of times I would come to him and I would say, Dad, you can't believe, this is going on and this is going on and this is going on and so on and so forth. And he would say a lot of times when there's so many things going on, you got to focus on what you can control, right? So, if I think about this, like I have no way of controlling when, for example, now that Anthropic's Fable and Mythos security LLMs have some certain ban to them and they're prevented. I have no idea when that ban's going to go away. I have no idea, when things will open up. I have no idea, I have no way of controlling those things. I have no way of controlling what it costs to, for OpenAI to deliver their service and they're losing billions. And maybe that has some downstream effects. Maybe somebody's using ChatGPT and you're worried like, well, don't get too hooked, don't put too many things in ChatGPT. They might go out of business. You can't control those things, right? So you got to focus on what you can control. You can control if you are asked to use these tools, figure out how to be good at them. Figure out how to take advantage of them in ways that benefit you. Figure out how to spend an extra 15 minutes a day learning these things, but control the things you can control. The things that you can't control, it's useful again to make yourself, show up, keep up and shut up, pay attention to what's going on in the room. But if you can't control it, you shouldn't be spending too many cycles worrying about it. Because again, those are just cycles that you're not spending getting better at something, becoming valuable, understanding the why of something are happening. The next thing I had is sort of goes in the same lines is be an expert at something, right? You can't be an expert at everything, but be an expert at something. And again, this kind of goes back to making yourself invaluable. You want to showcase that you've got some distinct knowledge, distinct talent that maybe is, yes, could somebody figure out a way to do what you do through AI and other stuff? Yeah, probably, right? Like we're seeing some pretty incredible things, but become the expert at the nuances of why that relates to your business. Become the expert at the nuances of how the output of that stuff is going to fit into, becoming the thing that is useful for your work or useful for your family or whatever that is. But find some areas where you can be an expertise. And again, that sort of kind of reinforces itself on focus on the things that you can control versus the things that you can't control. Next thing he always sort of told me, again, a lot of times I would come to him with, Dad, here's 10 problems and I'm trying to juggle these 10 different problems. And a lot of times it had to do with work stuff. But it also relates to people. He said, when in doubt, when things seem really chaotic, ultimately the two best things you can do is, number one, get closer to people, build relationships, make sure that you've got relationships with people. You don't just think about like, well, I know that company, or there's a group of people that, I could call if I needed to. Make sure you've got personal relationship with people, get closer to those relationships, strengthen those relationships. And then he also said, figure out, where the money, where the revenue is made in that world, whether it's the business world or, things that you have to do with your friends or whatever, and get closer to that. Right. And I tell this to people all the time, and we'll see this with AI as well. The further away you are from either, even if you're in the middle of where something's built, if you're not close enough to the people that make the decision as to whether to buy something, to whether to use something, whether to spend money on something, create the budgets for something, the further you are from those people, the people that are the people making the decisions and where the money is going, the more they don't know what you do, the more it's hard for them to realize, like, well, is Bill better than Steve? Is Mary better than Jane? So when things kind of get in doubt, figure out ways to get closer to the people that are making those decisions, have relationships with that stuff, and then get as close as you can to where the sort of the money piece of it takes place. Because again, those are high value places to be. Those are places in which, again, technology makes less of the decisions. A lot of times people make more of those decisions. So kind of keep that in mind. The next thing he had on his list, or that we always used to talk about, and again, a lot of these things go back to this idea of like when things feel like they're crazy. Again, in the AI world, it feels like, gosh, all this money's being spent. It feels like money's being lost. There's crazy amount of things that are happening. They're talking about job losses. It just feels like a lot of things. There's a lot of choice in what's going on. When things don't make sense, focus on fundamentals. And those fundamentals could mean a lot of different things. They could be, if your biggest worry is, hey, I'm concerned about my job, focus on the fundamentals of, well, what would that mean for your own personal finance, right? Have you paid off your bills? Do you have money in the right places where you can get to it relatively easily? Maybe it's, you're worried about, you're really stressed at work and so on and so forth. Are you focused on your health, right? On those fundamentals? Are you making sure that, I know you're busy with work but like, are you eating good things? Are you getting at least a reasonable amount of sleep? Are you drinking a lot of water? Are you getting out and going for a walk every day for 15 minutes? Like, focus on those fundamentals. It may be the fundamentals of just, I need to get better at this aspect of my job. If I don't get better at this aspect of my job, those 5 other aspects of my job, I'm building them on a very weak foundation. I'm building on the foundation of sand as opposed to a foundation of stone and rock and cement and so forth. So, you'd always come back to being like, focus on the fundamentals of whatever that thing is you're doing or the thing that you're worried about. And again, try and control what you can control. Again, a lot of these things sort of, are kind of self-reinforcing. They kind of tie back to each other, but they're a little bit different. The other thing we would talk about a lot, like when the internet was first starting off, which again, I've talked about a lot, has a lot of parallels to what's going on in the AI space. We would talk about, hey, it's crazy. This company is way, way up and they're not, it's weird that they're so far up, but their revenues aren't necessarily as much as this other company who's not up as much. And, like I was trying to make some sense out of it because maybe I was asking him about investment advice or, should I go work for some company because they offered some sort of equity in something? And, he would always say, look, it's important to understand that the way you're rationalizing these things, like, hey, does this seem like a good company? Does it seem like a solid company? Do the fundamentals of that company make sense to the cash flow? He would say, a lot of times markets can be irrational way longer than you can be solvent, right? So this is, kind of plays to the idea of sometimes markets are going to seem weird. You're going to do the math on the markets are, it's not going to make any sense. And you might think, oh, well, this is a perfect opportunity for it to flip. And I'm going to figure it out and it's going to flip. And, his thing was always like, be very careful that you understand the market better than somebody else. Even if you have done all the math, the timing of things is oftentimes the biggest deciding factor. Not necessarily did you figure out the math right. You can go back to that movie in the book, The Big Short, right? Those guys figured out the math, but their timing had to be right. Otherwise, they would have gone bankrupt. They happened to, get the timing right and the market collapsed and all those sort of things. But those of us, for example, that were in the middle of the internet bubble, like we couldn't see the other side of it. We couldn't see, we couldn't imagine with all this growth, with all these things going on, that at some point something would tip over. And I think right now with the AI market, there are people who are distinctly on one side that the market is incredibly irrational. There are people on the other side that are incredibly positive about it, even though the numbers don't necessarily make sense. And if you're trying to bet on exactly where it's going to pan out, those irrationalities, both on the very negative side and on the very positive side, sometimes because emotions involved, in addition to math and other sorts of things, those can remain longer than your rationality at this moment in time, right? And so it's important to, understand that, not get too hung up on it, and again, kind of go back to those things that we talked about before, your fundamentals, understanding understanding some aspect really well, being an expert regardless of if markets are up or down. And then the last thing, this kind of goes back to an old hockey analogy. There was an old saying for the guy who was the best hockey player at the time, a gentleman named Wayne Gretzky. They would say, Wayne, why are you so good at hockey? How come you seem to be so much better than everybody else? And he would say, well, I try and skate to where the puck is going, meaning I try and think a couple of steps ahead of where things are going, right? Because if everybody right now is focused on the here and now, they're all looking at the picture exactly the same way, it's very difficult to create any sort of differentiation. It's very difficult to, be not just lumped into the masses of what's going on, right? And so, my dad a lot of times would be like, try and think a couple of steps ahead. Try and think, okay, this is going on right now. What if A, B, and C happen? Okay, well, if A, B, and C, if A happens, what logically might happen next? If B happens, what might happen next? If C happens, what might happen next? And then he would also sort of say, that maybe that's on the positive side of things. Take a look at the negative side of things. What are some things that might happen? And then now you've sort of forced yourself to take a little bit bigger picture of what's going on. You don't know for sure if those things are going to happen, but you've painted yourself a little bit bigger picture. And again, if you're thinking about that analogy of skate to where the puck is going to be going, not where it is right now, it allows you to start to focus on, well, what skills should I work on? What relationship should I make? What things should I align myself to? Because I think 6 months from now, a year from now, 2 years from now, the world is going to be over here. And if I've been focusing on those, if I've been keeping up and showing up every day, in that direction, and you may not get it right, you're going to be in a much better position than if you're just sort of following where the world is right now, and your only view is where the world is right now, and you're only focused on those sort of things. You're not going to be prepared for a world that changes, and you have to recognize that the world is sort of always changing and so forth. So, anyways, 8 things. Sort of Father's Day related, sort of father related. Again, some of those may seem more conservative than you want to think about. Some of them may seem more uncertain than you're willing to think about. But, again, dads are always sort of thinking about, like, what have I gone through? What can I pass along to people? How can I view a situation, and try and, both create opportunity, but also, have protection on the downside of things. So anyways, just some fatherly advice, or at least thinking about, advice my dad gave me and trying to apply it to this AI world where things are a little bit crazy, a little bit uncertain, and sometimes the numbers don't always make sense. So anyways, with that, happy Father's Day, getting this one out a little bit on a Sunday morning. Hope everybody's doing well. Hope you can spend some time with family. Hope you get a chance to call dad, or, keep up with your kids if you're a father yourself. Hug your moms. They're part of the equation as well. And even though they get a day, they should probably get a whole bunch of days. So anyways, with that, we'll wrap it up. We'll talk to you next week. Thanks for listening. Thanks for telling a friend, and we will talk to you next week.
Thanks for listening. Check us out at theenterpriseaishow.com for past shows, newsletters, and all things Enterprise AI.